let's talk about roster assembly a little bit, and let's talk about the challenges and where kind of Rick Barnes is, and we'll kind of go big picture into this because it affects all sports, I think. But Tennessee's not bringing in the Hammond kid on an official visit. I asked, I think, both of you guys this question last week. I, is it possible that this is not a full roster for Rick Barnes, and not necessarily because he chooses it to be, but because of where you are in trying to build your assemble a roster, right? Like if Chaz Lanier comes here, Grant, you know exactly what his role. He knows what his role is going to be, right? I mean, that's an easy sell. Outside of that, what is the sell for Tennessee to somebody else in the transfer portal?
Well, I mean, it does kind of all hinge on Chaz Lanier. Like Tennessee's been all in on Chaz. They're going to stay all in on Chaz until they get some kind of answer or some kind of timeline or whatever. You got to land him at this point because you have 3 open spots sitting here on May, whatever it is, 6th, 7th. That's 23% of your scholarship roster is empty. And you need Chaz to step in and to be that guy that kind of takes that Dalton Connect role and scores it for you. The question is the other 2 spots. And I don't know if you're going to find those kind of guys in the portal. I kind of thought maybe they leave one spot open and another spot was going to be like a Ben Hammond, who was a 4-star or who is a 4-star point guard in the 2024 class, but he's more of a developmental guy. Stash him on the roster and he's an option for you at point guard moving forward. And for whatever reason, that doesn't happen. That visit doesn't end up happening. So I don't think you can go into a season. I don't think you should with 2 open scholarship spots. Like, it makes sense to me to leave one open for the summer, Rob, like we've seen them do that before. But obviously everything's going to hinge on Chaz, and then you got to figure out if you do get Chaz, what you want to do with one of those 2 spots. I would assume you want to fill at least one of those.
Yeah, I would. I mean, you definitely want to fill it. It goes without saying, all the chips are in the middle of the table for Chaz Lanier. But I almost wonder, Grant, if this isn't kind of a sign of the times, if it's not going to be harder to – bring a kid in who knows he's got no shot at playing as a freshman, just and not just because it's so easy to move as a player. I mean, do you want to? I mean, I think I'm not saying every kid will be this way, but I think a lot of kids will want to go somewhere and play as a freshman, knowing that they can trade up or improve their situation. But yeah, I just. Again, I don't think it's going to be all the way across the board, but I do think it's, we're going to be sitting here in April, May, sometime it's going to be normal to have, 2 or 3 open scholarship spots, not 6 or 7, but, to have a couple that where guys just want to wait. But to your point, I mean, if I'm Tennessee, based off, my experience with adding Tobey and adding Zakai in late July or August, I think hanging on to one is, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, if you think about those 2 guys, I'd like to know, or maybe we get Eric Kane to look this up while he's on the beach this week. Like how many programs really have added 2 kids like that late who have, helped you win games as freshmen? I mean, not just come in and been a factor, but really helped you win games as an NCAA tournament team. I mean, I'm sure Tennessee's not alone in that. There's a ton of teams in college basketball, but I bet that's pretty uncommon though to just pick kids up at that time of the year, the summer, stick them on your roster. And immediately, I mean, Zakai played probably 15, 20 minutes a game on a really good NCAA tournament team.
I mean, Zakai had established himself by November when Tennessee went to Connecticut and played in that tournament and played North Carolina, and he scored like 17 off the bench. I mean, that was how quickly he had, and that's how quickly he made an impact. And I've heard Rick say this before, and I think this is a line you try to walk where you want to fill spots, but you don't want to just give somebody a scholarship to give somebody a scholarship. You don't want to bring somebody in unless you think they're going to help you down the line, because if that person does type a scholarship and that person is here for multiple seasons, then it's kind of wasted space if you don't think that guy's going to help you. So it's a fine line between you want to fill spots and you want to have the right amount of personnel. Like these 2 spots, they're in my eyes, they're going to be developmental guys anyway. If you get Chaz and then you have 2 open spots. So they're not going to impact next season's team very much besides what you have on scout team and practice and all that stuff. Maybe something, the last guy off the bench. So it's something where you have to juggle it. And I think it's made more difficult in the transfer portal era when it is easier for guys to move, where you want to fill spots, but you don't want to just fill the spot to fill the spot and not be happy with what you look like. I think you definitely got to think about leaving spots open and maybe give yourself a chance to if you do find something you like later on in the cycle.
Well, and how hard is it to fill a spot in out of the transfer portal? And I think football looks at this from the running back standpoint as well. I think this is a transfer portal question. This is not a Rick Barnes basketball program question. But if you're a coach, how hard is it to go out and convince a guy in the portal to come be a part of your program when you can't offer? That guy looks at the depth chart and goes, you know what? Yeah, you go there. If I transfer in there, maybe I get 8 minutes a game, 6 minutes a game. Maybe I get, 8 carries a game. But then if I get passed up by somebody that, that they think is a younger player who's going to be better, you know what I'm saying? Like, to me, it's easy to go all in on Chaz Lanier, right? I mean, Chaz Lanier knows it's pretty easy to sell him on what his role would be on the team. But if you're not offering, if you don't have that kind of role, regardless of sport, how hard is it to go out and recruit somebody out of the transfer portal and land that guy?
I think it's a huge deal. I mean, just enormous. I mean, it was, to some extent, I mean, we saw it last year with Tennessee trying, in quarterback recruiting. You
good point.
Had, 2 scholarship guys on the roster, and I bet, I bet that won't be the last time that it happens to Tennessee or somebody else, at this level. And yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating aspect of, of coaching that you just didn't even exist 2 or 3 years ago. You didn't even have to worry about it. And Hubbard, I think your point is a good one. I don't think a lot of fans, necessarily think about it. It's not just adding the best guy you can. It's adding the best guy that's, either not going to upset the apple cart necessarily. I mean, he's got to be clearly better and have a clearly defined role, in most cases, or you risk, creating locker room problems. And on the basketball side, I think Tennessee is probably in a better spot than most, because I just think they're so upfront, the staff, with their players about, what their roles are, what their minutes are, what this, we're bringing this guy in, and this, if we get him, this is what his role would be. And player X, you'll be competing with him. And, so I'm not saying that basketball staff is perfect about it, but I think I would be willing to bet they avoid a lot of the pratfalls that some other staffs fall into, because they don't, play games with kids about, what their roles are going to be, or what their minutes are going to be, or what the competition is going to be like.
I mean, when Hubbs was asking that question, my mind went to Nico in the quarterback position, and you need depth there. You want depth there, but it's easier said than done to get quality depth at that position. And it's the same thing, I think, at Tennessee with Zakai Ziegler. I mean, when Minnesota, Elijah Hawkins went in the portal, Tennessee was on the list of like 16, 17 teams that maybe had reached out to him, and he had crazy good numbers last year. A really good player. He ends up at Texas Tech, but I mean, he's too good not to contact, but also how much of a realistic shot do you have for him to come here and split minutes at best with Zakai, or play it too, or change positions or whatever. Like, that's the difficulty when you have a guy like Zakai at point guard starting, a guy like Nico at quarterback that is going to be the guy. How do you get the guys in here to be that depth piece? It's a, like Rob talked about, a new challenge, a new wrinkle, a new, I don't know, way you have to adapt and change and figure out how to make it work in this kind of new era.
Well, and I think the other challenge too is,
because Hubbard, I would say,
go ahead, Rob. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I was just going to say that. What's your opinion? But I think unless there's an extreme tie, like with an assistant coach, or your hometown school didn't recruit you out of high school and never come back, I think even before NIL, I think the first thing these kids look at in either sport is the depth chart, is the roster. Now NIL is going to be a factor, you know what I mean? But it's the very first, and to Grant's point about the kid from Minnesota, first thing he does is look at Tennessee's roster. Oh, all SEC point guard. Nope. Move it on.
Well, but because you're realistically going to get an NIL deal wherever you go, right? Like, it's not like the only really good NIL opportunity you have is at a school that has depth in front of you. So at some point, the NIL stuff, I don't want to say cancels out, but it becomes pretty equal across the board, right? I mean, nobody's going to be drastically financially higher in an NIL deal than everybody else in your school. There'll be 2 or 3 schools within the zip code same ballpark of where you're at NIL deal. And then it comes back to your relationship and your depth chart as a transfer. But those transfers don't want to go set. I think the other interesting balance with this is, and it's not upsetting the apple cart from a financial standpoint, but upsetting the apple cart from a youth standpoint and his development. I mean, if you've got a young player coming in and he's coming on your campus, signed, locked in, and then all of a sudden you bring in somebody at his position out of the portal, how much does that mess with that guy's future in your program? So now you're balancing that part of it too. And we talked about Freddie DeLeon. Rob, you've mentioned this multiple times. If Freddie DeLeon had known that everybody was coming back, that came back when he arrived at Tennessee in January, Freddie DeLeon wouldn't have signed with Tennessee. Not because he didn't like Tennessee, not because NIL wasn't good. It would not have made sense for him to come back, for him to come here with everything that was coming back. So how do you balance these coaches? How do you balance the immediate help, stunt development of young player to the point that you might send young player packing? That's another level of this that I think is a pretty fascinating element to how you deal with roster management in all sports. Obviously, basketball this time of year with all the chaos that's been going on.
Well,
yeah, I think
it's not just roster.
No, go ahead, Rob.
I'll be real quick, Grant. I want your opinion too, because I don't think it's just roster management. Well, I mean, this maybe falls under the umbrella of roster management, but it's also how you recruit. I mean, because Rick and his staff built this program on Admiral Schofield's, Grant Williams, Kyle Alexander's. I don't think you can do that anymore. I mean, if you just, I think the developmental aspect, and I hate it for this staff because I think they're great at it. I'm not saying it's going away; it'll never go away. I think it's been minimized to a really big degree.
I think you can build it on those guys if you also mix in the impact transfers, and not saying a Dalton Connect every time you go to the portal, but somebody that's going to come in and produce and be a big time contributor and part of your starting five, your rotation, whatever. And I think there's multiple categories to it, because I do think Bishop Boswell is something that factors into this whole Ben Hammond situation. Because
I agree.
And Tennessee was late on Bishop Boswell. They made up a ton of ground in that recruitment to get him and sign him in November. He's a top 100 prospect, four-star North Carolina kid. And then Ben Hammond is also a point guard, and you're bringing him kind of late in on the process and kind of getting involved. Here we are in May, and maybe that makes you think what's going on there, or I guess it makes you think from Bishop's point of view, like what's going on here? Why are they looking at this guy plays the same position? They already got me in November, something like that. So I think you have to balance that. I mean, you look at a guy like Cade Tyson. Tennessee was all in on Cade Tyson for a while. I also think once Tennessee knew they were going to get Igor Milicic, that if you bring in Cade Tyson, then you're stunting somebody else's growth that's already on the roster. Somebody like a Cam Carr, who has a lot of upside, who the staff loves, who they think is going to play big minutes for them in the future and be a big piece of the program. So I think you have to look at it both from the prep prospect point of view, from the current roster point of view. And then I think there's different categories for these guys that are in the portal, like an Elijah Hawkins that has multiple years. He wants to go somewhere, and like Rob said, he's going to look at the depth chart. He wants to be the man somewhere. I think there's other guys that maybe have 1 year left to play who haven't won a ton, who want to go somewhere, and maybe their roles diminished a little bit, but they're part of a winning program that gives them a chance in the NCAA tournament to go rounds and advance and kind of be part of one of those runs. So these guys, these college coaches, man, they're earning their paychecks with all the different, irons on the fire and trying to adjust into whatever this kind of new chaos is.
It's total chaos, and it's fascinating to see all the different levels of it, because it's not just as simple and as black and white as you would be. And I think Rick Barnes has done, for an older coach, a veteran coach, I think he's adapted as well as anybody in that level age group has adapted. There's some other guys who just left the game, right? They just walked away and said, I've had enough. And Rick Barnes has not done that with the portal. He's embraced the portal. The question is, what's the next step of embracing? Do you have to, Rick Barnes is about, hey, you got to earn it. You got to earn our trust. You got to earn it to get on the court. Do you have to play younger players earlier now if you're the basketball coach? Do you have to, I don't say guarantee them minutes, do you have to be willing to put guys in there at an earlier stage, particularly if they come out with this rule that says you could transfer it midterm. How much do you have to adapt to that kind of stuff? And look, Rick Barnes is not going to compromise the core values of what he is, but where's the challenge with that? I mean, you got a lot of time, Rob, invested in Tobey Awaka, right? And Tobey left because he just didn't think the minutes were going to be there, right? I mean, that's a big part of why Tobey left, is it not?
Yeah, I mean that's the biggest part. So yeah, I mean, and for this staff, I mean, I just again that the developmental aspect's not going to go away. It's not. It's never going to go away. But I just I don't know how many more guys at this level you'll see like Kyle Alexander, who came in and just was a shadow, a flicker of what he became 4 years later, and stayed and worked. And so I think the key thing you said there about this program in particular is that he won't compromise. I mean, he would leave, if it got to the point where the only way you can get player X is guarantee him 25 minutes a game, something of that nature. And that I don't see it getting to that point here, but it's I don't have anything to add but to pile on. I mean, to his credit, I never thought he'd get to this point where he not only is, kind of okay with it. I swear, man, I think he kind of likes it. I mean, I think he really likes, kind of the front office aspect of it, being able to plug holes and, create your team or really, not about create it, but really augment your team in a significant way in a very short period of time. And I think he's great. At the recruiting aspect, he is great on an official visit. He's great on a home visit. I think at this point in his career, what he's not great about is, maybe going and sitting in a high school gym on, Wednesday afternoon at 2:00 and then having to fly back and, then coach his own team at practice. I'm not saying he's not good at it. I'm saying that he'd rather be, Knoxville watching film. But, when it's just the kid, the parents, the mom, the high school coach, the kid, I mean, he's as good as it gets. And I think that, that's part of, that maximizes, his talents, the way, the transfer portal, the way it's so hyper compressed into 2 or 3 weeks of activity.
I think he's put in his time to be able to not feel like sitting in a gym on a Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah,
I think
let me make that clear for sure.
He's sat in a lot of gyms in 37 years or however long it's been his coaching career. I do think he's adapted in terms of, he's said this and he said it publicly. Like, if you're bringing in a guy and he's not going to help you in the first 2 years, you might as well not bring him in, because he's not going to sit around and wait 2 years. And I think they've acknowledged that a little bit more. And I think they've adapted in the portal. Like, are we going to bring this guy in? Does this guy feel a glaring need, or is this guy kind of redundant? And does he stunt the growth of somebody on the roster right now? I think that's adapting. But I do agree with Rob. I do think he enjoys the kind of the portal recruiting is kind of like just parachuting in, dropping in, and doing it so quickly and compressed. And it's not a multi-year relationships, earn it, show up, put in the time, all that kind of thing. It is a very compressed 2 week, 3 week, whatever, 1 month. Try to get you on campus, try to close the deal, and see if you can get in this program and help and build this roster out that way. So,
all right, go ahead. My last two things here, but before we move on to update on some other things and a couple other topics here. What's the number in basketball? What do you think the number is in terms of how many guys you would like to be hunting for in the portal? I don't know that you want 5 every year. What is that number? What do you think's the optimal number if you're a basketball coach, if you were a basketball coach? And secondly, is portal evaluations easier than high school evals or harder than high school evals when you talk about the factor of culture and all those types of things, when you only have 2 weeks to figure out who they are as opposed to multiple years to have them on campus to see if they fit in?
I think it's easier. I mean, for this staff, I think it's easier for one reason: the character stuff, the behind the scenes stuff. I mean, college basketball coaching is a small community once you get in it, and so I'm not saying Tennessee is unique in this way, but I'd say that the connections that this staff has because of Rick Barnes, because of Greg Polinsky, the time that they have in this game. My point being, I think you can find out a lot about a kid in a hurry. Either you know somebody from his school, or multiple people in his conference that have coached against him, prepared against him, heard everything about him for the last 2 or 3 years. And I think the level, the intelligence network that's available to not just Tennessee, but to all coaches for that kind of stuff, I think it's hard to overestimate just how much information they can gather, and from people that they have known a long time, and from people they have relationships with.
And I think it's nice to just have something on tape where you can see these guys against other high major competition.
See, I think that part's a lot easier, don't you, Grant?
Right.
Personally,
and it's going to be limited, especially if it's a Northern Colorado Dalton Connect. He's going to have limited games against Power 5, but at least you have some kind of film. I think that would be easier. Now, at the same time, Rick has excelled, like Rob talked about earlier, with finding a Zakai Ziegler and finding a Tobe Awaka and finding a Grant Williams, who was, I think, Ivy League bound back in the day before he committed to Tennessee. So I think you have more kind of on tape hard evidence, and like Rob's talking about with talking to other coaches and figuring out who these guys are. But I think the staff has also excelled at finding some guys and finding out how good those guys really can be and how overlooked they were, and doing a good job identifying those guys and evaluating them on the recruiting trail.
3 is 3 your number? Would 3 be the max number you would ideally want to have?
I mean, I think it's obviously going to be change from year to year, but I would not want to bring in more than 3, or it would have to be some unusual circumstances. And we might be different, but I bet Grant's the same way. I mean, I appreciate culture as being important and as being a factor in winning way more than I ever did before this old guy got here. I mean, but for that reason, I mean, I don't think you want to be bringing in so much new blood every year. I mean, I think having some continuity to what your standards are, to what the expectations are, is important.
I think you're probably losing a couple seniors every year. You're probably bringing in a couple prep guys that you've signed on the recruiting trail, so that's kind of a wash. So I think 2 to 3 would be kind of ideal, because once it gets to be more than that, you're losing a lot through the portal. There's a lot of turnover. That's not going to be great on a year in and year out basis. I think 2 or 3 is a good number.